I am constrained in what I can say because he asked me to make the bio as short as humanly possible.
Thank you for that. Are you done now?
I've learned a lot from his writing about medical research and uses, and now we all will learn about it.
Great.
So
Thank you. Thanks. All right. Yeah. Clap now because you won't be clapping at the end. So I've got this new book out about whistleblowing. Despite the title, which is a little misleading, it's about whistleblowers. So basically the kind of people who expose the crimes and sins of their own organization, their own group. And if you read books and watch movies, you know how these whistleblower stories are supposed to go because you've seen them a million times. They're what Kurt Vonnegut used to call man in a hole stories, right? Somebody gets into trouble and then gets out again. So he used to plot this out on a graph. So the line goes straight, takes a little dip, and then kind of comes back more or less to baseline. He says, look, people love this story. And the reason they love this story is because it has such a reassuring message. Job survives his ordeals and then is rewarded by God for his faithfulness. Dorothy defeats the wicked witch and then finds her way home to Kansas. The whistleblower exposes the truth and brings down the corrupt organization. So the man gets out of the hole, right? But there's something missing in this account. And what's missing in this account is what it's like to be in the hole, right? Because when you're in the hole, your thoughts tend to turn inward on yourself, and the world outside the hole fades away. And when you're in the hole, all you can think of is yourself and how to get out of the hole. In fact, you might not even know it's a hole that you're in, right? Could be a cave, could be a tunnel, could be the trunk of a car, could be a coffin, could be a well. I can go on. It could be the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's porch steps. You don't know. All you know is that you're thrashing around in the dark. And so the book is framed introduction and epilogue by my own experience here at the U, where I spent the better part of 7 years trying to get an external investigation of the suicide of a young man named Dan Markingson in a research study conducted by our Department of Psychiatry. This is a picture of Dan and his mother, Mary Weiss. Thumbnail version of the story: Dan is psychotic, he is delusional, he is under a civil commitment order in 2003 when he's recruited from a locked unit over at Fairview into a study of antipsychotic drugs over the objections of his mother, Mary Weiss, who was his only family member. So she didn't want him in the study. He was not competent to consent. He was threatening to kill people. He was threatening to kill her, for example. And he was under a stay of commitment order that legally bound him to obey the recommendations of his psychiatrist, the one who was directing him into the study. But Mary was told, look, he's an adult. He signed the consent form. He's in the study. And so he was signed up, put on a study drug, sent to the halfway house. Mary Weiss spent the next 4 months trying to get him out of the study. She could see how he was deteriorating. She called, she emailed, she went to the department, she wrote letters to the chair of psychiatry, warning again and again, he's getting worse. I think he may kill somebody. I think he may kill himself. Finally, she leaves a voice message for the study coordinator saying exactly that. Does he have to kill himself or someone else before anybody will do anything? That was not returned. And 3 weeks later, he tried to decapitate himself in the bathroom of the halfway house where he was staying. His body was found in the bathroom, box cutter frozen in his hand, along with a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. So I spent a long time, somewhere between 6 and 7 years, digging into this story and trying to get it investigated. I wrote about it for Mother Jones Magazine in 2010, spent another 5 years filing complaints to regulatory bodies, writing editorials, lobbying politicians, organizing protests, petitions, vigils, campus events, all of it with zero success, no sign of success at all. And as you can imagine, this did not make me a popular figure in the medical school, or I should say in the bioethics center. Finally, with the help of Arnie Carlson, former governor, we managed to get an investigation by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, state watchdog agency that you may know of here in Minnesota. And when it came back in March of 2015, it felt like a vindication. So pressure to be enrolled in the study, conflicts of interest, lack of competence, everything that you or any, I think, reasonable person could see in the study from the very start. And if this had been a movie, this is the point at which the credits would have started to roll. But it's not a movie. And here's the thing. Turns out that vindication isn't really the same thing as getting out of the hole. It's more like crawling out of a ditch in the middle of the desert. And I would say, if anything, this kind of vindication made my friends and colleagues in the medical school resent and hate me even more than before. And I think my co-conspirators in this, Lee Turner and Nikki Jerry, would say the same thing. And to be honest, it didn't really change anything. There was no official apology from the university. There was no compensation for Mary Weiss for the loss of her son. There were no sanctions for the researchers and no real reform. And so today, 9 years later, the whole episode has been almost completely forgotten, except for a handful of people here, like, for example, Chuck Turchik and me. So several years ago, as a way of trying to figure out how things might have gone better, I started teaching a class on research scandals, on medical research scandals, abuses of human subjects. It's a very demoralizing class, all scandals all the time, 2 a week for a semester. And we start with the classics, Tuskegee syphilis study, the Willowbrook hepatitis study, and we move on up to things that are going on very often at the time that I'm teaching the course, like the forced ketamine studies over at HCMC a few years ago, or the Paolo Macchiarini fraudulent trachea implants in Sweden. So what I wanted to do by that was to try to put a lot of these scandals side by side and try to see what patterns emerged. Like if I could understand the way these things usually go. And of course, the big question at the back of my mind is the University of Minnesota a uniquely bad institution, or are other institutions just as bad? And what I found was that my experience here was actually pretty typical. I feel confident in saying research institutions never do the right thing. I've yet to come across a case. They deny wrongdoing, they stonewall the press, they protect their own faculty members, they rarely apologize without being forced by virtue of litigation or a regulatory body, and basically do whatever they can to avoid compensating the victims or their families. And the whistleblowers, of course, are ostracized, fired, sued, and in at least one case that I wrote about, reported to the police. The other thing I found out is that whistleblowers are actually pretty rare. In most cases that we look at in the class, doctors and nurses know that patients are being harmed. They know they're being lied to or exploited. Often they know these things for years, sometimes even decades, and they do nothing. They say nothing. They just stay quiet. So I started wondering, what is it about these people who do step out of the line and speak out? What's different about them? What's different about their circumstances? How do they explain what they did and why they did it? And how do they differ from the people who say nothing, right? How do they explain it? So I'm going to start with the second question. This is not what the issue of the bystanders. This is not what the book is about, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Right. So the question is, because there's always a question that I get at the end of this talk, why don't bystanders speak out and say something? Right. And you might think this is an easy question to answer. And what you do is you go in, talk to the bystanders and say, why didn't you say anything? And it turns out academics have done this over the past 30 years, usually in corporations and government bodies, not medicine. But they'll ask people who said nothing, why did you keep quiet? And they will generally say some combination of three things. One, I would have been punished. Two, it would have been futile. And three, I don't rat out my own group. So kind of loyalty here. So this is what they say. The question is, are they being honest with themselves? And I'm not sure they are. So consider this empirical study. Psychology experiment about whistleblowing done in the Netherlands 12 years ago. You'll probably recognize the second name there. Published in the journal Social Influence. So it's modeled on the famous Milgram obedience studies where 65% of subjects obeyed the orders of a man in a white coat who ordered them to give what they thought could be lethal electrical shocks to another person. So in this version, what they wanted to find out was whether a group of university students would blow the whistle on a research study that they designed to be obviously dangerous. And so here's what they did. They got the students all together in a room. They told them they were looking for help recruiting subjects for a study. And then they arranged for them to be approached by a kind of stern, formally dressed scientist who's actually just an actor. So the guy I'm thinking looks a little bit like this, right? Man in a white coat who knows, who seems like he knows what he's doing. So the fake scientist comes in, tells them about his study, says, we're doing this sensory deprivation experiment. And basically what we do is we take our subjects and we lock them in a sensory deprivation pod where they can't see anything or they can't hear anything. And then we measure their brain activity to see what's going on. And he says, we did a pilot study of this. It didn't go all that great. Of course, a lot of the subjects started to panic and they got delusional and hallucinated and their thoughts got disordered and they were begging us to let them out of the pod, but we couldn't do that, of course, because that would have ruined the study. But anyway, we're going to try it again. We tweaked a few things, right? So he says, what I need from you is help recruiting subjects. Will you help me by recommending this subjects to your friends and your acquaintances? So I say, we need you to get in touch with at least 4 people and can be email or text and use at least 2 of the words exciting, incredible, great, or superb when you're describing the study. And so they wanted to make the study as easy as possible for subjects to refuse and blow the whistle. So they're given plenty of time to consider their decisions. The fake scientist leaves the room so they don't have to be face-to-face with an authority figure. And everybody is told, look, this doesn't have ethics approval yet from the Research Oversight Committee. And we're going to give you a form. If you have any ethical problems with this study at all, any concerns, any questions, just put them down here and we'll make sure that it's delivered anonymously to the Research Oversight Committee, and there'll be no way to trace it back to you. So I'm going to tell you how many blew the whistle, but before I do that, let me tell you about a twist to the study. So what they decided to do was break them down into 2 different groups. And one group was presented with this scenario just in theory, kind of like I'm presenting it to you as a hypothetical. Would you, if you were approached, would you recruit subjects into this study? And in that case, almost nobody could imagine themselves participating, right? 96% said they would either disobey the scientist or blow the whistle or do both of them. So that was in theory. In practice, it turned out to be very different. When the subjects were actually put in the situation where they actually got the pitch from the fake scientist, over 3/4 complied. So 77% wrote emails or texts to their friends using those words, amazing, incredible, superb, and so on. And how many blew the whistle? 9%, right? So less than 1 in 10. 96 said they would, only 9% did. Now, this is a very different kind of situation from reality. I will tell you that. But what is interesting to me about this is the contrast between this and why bystanders said they wouldn't blow the whistle. I was afraid of retribution. I wouldn't have accomplished anything, and I don't rat out my own group. Well, this study was designed so that none of these applied, and they still didn't blow the whistle. So whatever's going on is something other than what people tell themselves. So that's the bystanders. What about the whistleblowers, which is what the book is actually really about? I wanted to talk to whistleblowers and try to understand why they felt compelled to do what they did and whether they were successful and what happened to them. So these are the ones that I picked. There are actually a few more than this in the book, but these are the, these are the main cases. If this were a man in the whole story, I would be able to report to you happily that these whistleblower stories have happy endings. But that would not be true. They don't. In fact, there's a rare whistleblower who doesn't have a lot of ambivalence, including moral ambivalence about their experience. And a lot of them come away deeply scarred, even when the whistleblowing succeeds. I mean, I was talking to some of these people, about studies that they were involved with in the 1970s. So people in their 80s, right? And they're scarred, and the scars mark them for the rest of their lives. Even when they're not fired, even when they're not financially ruined, even if they win, because the world doesn't look the same to them anymore. So why do they do it? When I first started talking to whistleblowers, I thought, well, there would be a simple way to find this out. You go to them and say, why did you blow the whistle? But it turns out when you do that, they don't really give you straightforward answers. So by and large, they don't really defend themselves with a moral argument. They don't cite the Hippocratic Oath. They don't talk about foundational principles. They don't cite legal statutes. They don't quote the Bible. What they do is say things like, well, if I said nothing, what would I say to my children? Or how can I keep quiet and look at myself in the mirror every morning? So they answer the question with these kind of non-answers. So let me give you an example. This is not someone I interviewed, although I really would have liked to. This involves Richard Nixon. I try to work Richard Nixon into every talk I give, as the students in my bioethics course will know. So if you remember the Senate Watergate hearings in the summer of 1973, there's an iconic moment that would be seared in your brain, which is this moment when Alexander Butterfield, an aide to Bob Haldeman, told the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon had installed a taping system in the Oval Office. So there were recordings, right? This turns out to be the pivotal moment in Nixon's downfall because he can't hide, behind his lies and deception anymore. But I don't want to point out really what Butterfield did. What interests me is the way he defended himself. Because when he was asked later, why did you do it? He said, well, I answered truthfully because I'm a truthful person. In other words, I did it because that's the kind of person I am. Now, I'm not the first person who's talked to whistleblowers and noticed the kinds of non-explanations that they give. Terrific book on whistleblowing is by the political scientist Fred Alford, University of Maryland, retired now. Spent years interviewing whistleblowers, admires whistleblowers, but is struck by what he says is the tendency of whistleblowers to turn a moral question about the well-being of others into a moral question about themselves. He says, look, even if they're deeply concerned about the research subjects and their well-being, even if they're acting completely out of principle with no thought to gain to themselves, that's not what they talk about. What they talk about is themselves, about facing their kids, about holding their heads up, about looking in the mirror. And he calls this narcissism moralized. He says, Whistleblowers act because they're obsessed with their own moral purity. And when they find themselves in organizations that are cruel or corrupt, they rebel. They don't want to be thought of like everybody else in the organization. Now, I admire Alfred's book, and I would not want to say that there's no element of truth there, but I actually think he's wrong about this. In my conversations with whistleblowers, what I hear is not narcissism. What I hear is the ethic of honor and shame. Yes, it's true that whistleblowers do talk about themselves. That's what honor and shame are all about. They're about maintaining your self-respect by holding yourself accountable for your moral failures. So this is the distinguishing feature of honor as an ethic. It's about your obligations to yourself. So of course, whistleblowers talk about themselves. It's perfectly natural. Ethic of honor is fundamentally about respect and self-respect. That's what people mean when they say things like, how could I hold my head up? I mean, what better image could you get of the struggle for self-respect, right? Because honor is not just about your own self-respect. It's about getting the respect of others as well. That's why insults require a response in the honor ethic. It's also about deserving respect. In the honor ethic, you want to be the kind of person who is worthy of the respect you get. And if you fail, you feel ashamed. That's not wounded narcissism. That's just what happens when an honorable person fails to measure up to the honor code. So let me give you some examples. Ron Jones. This is one of the 3 doctors who exposed the so-called unfortunate experiment at National Women's Hospital in New Zealand. Study with where women with a precursor of cervical cancer were left untreated, sometimes for decades, and eventually developed cervical cancer and died. When I asked him, you know, what tipped the balance for you, his response was, it's probably a reflection of the nature of the man in you. Or Oscar Simonson, one of the cardiovascular surgeons at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. He's one of the 4 doctors who helped expose the crimes of Paolo Macchiarini. He said, well, because I have to be able to hold my head up. Or John Pasando at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle. He said, look, I'd like to think I've never hurt another person in this life, at least not deliberately, and that's just who I am. To me, these people sound a lot like Alex Butterfield. I did it because I'm the kind of person who does that. That's the language of honor. Now, let me back up, take a step back. Whenever I mention the word honor, I can feel resistance in the room, and I feel I need to explain a little, because it feels like a word from another era and not entirely a good one. So when you hear it, you may be thinking honor killings. You may be thinking military violence. You may be thinking about The Godfather, because there is a serious downside to the honor ethic, and the downside is violence. My purpose here is not to endorse the honor ethic or suggest in any way that people driven by honor are more likely to blow the whistle. What I am suggesting, my job is interpretive, right? Sometimes when I talk about this, there'll be a question afterwards, and they'll say, you know, this talk of honor just makes me really uncomfortable. I'd really feel better if you talked about professional ethics. And my response is, that would be fine if anybody I talk to ever mentioned professional ethics. That's just not the way that they talk, right? They talk about facing themselves in the mirror. They talk about holding their heads up. So if it makes you feel any better, and if you know you're squirrely about using the term honor, just substitute the word integrity instead. It's very similar. The reason I use honor is because in the honor ethic, it's unlike, you know, with integrity so much, is very important not just to do the right thing, but to be seen by others to do the right thing, right? And so this seems to be like a critical part of the whistleblower's kind of moral and existential struggle. How do you maintain your self-respect when you have lost the respect of your community? Now, earlier I said one of the troubling things about, these interviews that I found is that whistleblowers are often haunted by their experience, even if it looks from the outside as if they have won, right? And it's not just because they were threatened or fired or formally punished, although a lot of them were. There seems to be something deeper going on, that their lives have been divided into two parts. There's before they blew the whistle, there's after they blow the whistle, and in between is this sort of profound existential break. Now, I can try to explain it, my interpretation anyway. Every whistleblower is different, of course, but I think part of it is to do with what whistleblowers tend to be like as people, because blowing the whistle takes a certain amount of idealism. Cynics don't blow the whistle. They're convinced that the system is corrupt and it will accomplish nothing except, get blowback onto them. To blow the whistle, you need to have some kind of expectation that if you speak out about something that's obviously cruel or corrupt or unfair, then others on the outside are going to see it in the same way. And it turns out that almost never happens, right? So you think the authorities are going to leap into action, and they don't. You think your colleagues are going to stand by you, and they don't. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're treated like Judas Iscariot. And so you come away really shaken and kind of disoriented because your whole view of the way the world works has been disrupted. And that can drive people to a really dark place. So there's one conversation that I had about this that really sticks with me. It was with Matthias Corbaccio. So Matthias is one of the cardiovascular surgeons in Sweden who helped expose the crimes, and I say crimes because he's going to prison, of Paolo Macchiarini at the Karolinska Institute. And Matthias told me a story from his time in high school. He actually grew up in California, not Sweden. And he says, when I was in high school, the police found cocaine in the car of a friend of mine. And he told everybody it was mine, right? He said, I was 17 years old. I'd never done cocaine in my life. But that feeling of being wrongly accused stuck with him. He said, blowing the whistle felt like that, right? It's not just that the real offenders get off, it's that you are seen with such contempt. All your illusions that there's some sort of justice in the world get shattered. So I think that's part of it, this kind of existential disillusionment. A lot of it also has to do with identity, because if you're a doctor in an academic medical center, when you blow the whistle, you become radioactive. Nobody wants to be around you. Even people who might secretly be sympathetic are afraid to tell you so because they're worried, what if I become radioactive too? Right? Just being seen in the presence of the whistleblower is enough to contaminate them. And so what this means is the whistleblowers are sent into exile, right? They're sort of cast out and cut off from a professional community that's given them their sense of who they are. And they're cut off precisely because they've done what they believe the honor code requires them to do. Now, it turns out there's another reason to talk about honor, because honor is especially important in medical research. The oversight of medical research was set up as an honor system. It was done that way intentionally, right? Research is not formally regulated like a business is. Nobody from the government is standing there over a researcher's shoulder in the lab or on the wards, making sure that they do what they say they'll do, right? So there are no health and safety inspectors coming in and inspecting the place like they would in a restaurant, say, or a factory. We just trust medical researchers to do what they say they're doing. We trust them to be honest and to do the right thing. So it is like an honor code in theory, but like any honor code, it depends on bystanders to speak out when they see abuses. And that almost never happens. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, the sense of honor or personal integrity, if you like, that a lot of whistleblowers seem to feel. There's also something else. If you've ever seen Ibsen's play, An Enemy of the People, it's about this whistleblower doctor, Thomas Stockman, who tries to warn the town that the water is contaminated. And nobody believes him. And they all turn on him, even his own family, most of them turn on him. And the play ends with him sort of standing with his fist in the air saying, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands alone." Not exactly. It turns out that standing alone is a recipe for self-immolation. Never try to do this alone. If you look at medical whistleblowers who have achieved at least some measure of success, even a small measure of success, and survive psychologically to tell about it, what you'll find is that there often is not a single whistleblower standing alone. There's a group working together. And so in Auckland, New Zealand, there were 3, Bill McIndoe, Jock McLean, and Ron Jones. Ron is the only survivor. With the Machiavelli scandal, there were 4, 3 cardiovascular surgeons and a critical care doctor. In Cincinnati, the whistleblower, an English professor named Martha Stevens, was working with her entire junior faculty association. And at Willowbrook, the whistleblower, a man named Mike Wilkins, was actually part of an entire collective of activist doctors who were, many of whom were living together under the same roof. So solidarity, it turns out, is important for surviving this whole thing psychologically. But that's not the only thing. So let's go back for a minute to that original Milgram study. Yes, it's very bleak, and most people, when they read about or learn about the Milgram study, they only learn about a piece of it. But Milgram actually did a lot of studies where he would manipulate the variables. And what he would find is that he could tip the scales in the study away from obedience and towards individual conscience by manipulating those conditions. And the main way he could do that is put other people in the room. So, for example, if the fake scientist is accompanied by a second fake scientist who comes in and says, "I don't know, Jim, we may be going too far this time." Turns out that none of the subjects would agree to push the button and do what they thought was giving an electrical shock to the innocent victim. And if they're put at a table with 2 other subjects who are actually Confederates who are saying, "No, man, I'm not doing this," neither will the subject themselves. So in other words, people in the study are far more likely to follow their conscience if they don't feel isolated and alone in their dissent. The key to dissent is solidarity. Telling this to sociologists, but philosophers often don't know this. So let me just finish with, I try to keep this talk as demoralizing as possible. So let me just finish with another demoralizing thing that I learned from the class. I talked about bystanders. I talked about the whistleblowers. What about the researchers in charge of the studies? What comes of them? Amazingly, I taught bioethics for like 25 years before it even occurred to me to ask this question. What happened to the people in charge of these disgraceful studies? So I got another story to tell you here. It takes place in June of 2017 in Cincinnati. I'd gone to Cincinnati to meet this woman, Martha Stevens, who was the whistleblower English professor who exposed the Cincinnati radiation studies back in 1972. So these were Pentagon-funded studies during the Vietnam War to figure out what would radiation do to American soldiers in case of a nuclear attack, right? Would they pass out? Would they vomit? How long could they stay conscious before their plane crashed? These kinds of things. And to To do that, a radiologist by the name of Eugene Sanger was subjecting poor cancer patients, 60% of them Black, to total body irradiation without telling them why, without telling them it was for the military, without telling them that it might kill them. And so I had read that the hospital at the university had been forced to put up a memorial to the victims of that study. I'd never heard of a hospital doing this kind of thing voluntarily or involuntarily. And so I decided I need to see this. So I got to Cincinnati and went to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, could not find the memorial. I asked around. Nobody there seemed to know where the memorial was. In fact, they didn't even know what I was talking about when I talked about the radiation studies in 1972. But finally, after calling around all over the hospital to any department that had radio in the beginning, radiology, radioisotope lab, they found a woman who knew what I was talking about. And she led me through this kind of long series of underground tunnels down in the sub-basement until we got to a stairwell. And we went up into what looked like a courtyard of the sort where hospital employees might sneak out to smoke. I remember there was some big equipment. There was a parking ramp nearby, but no memorial. And so I said, you know, where's the memorial? And she said, oh, yeah, there it is over there. And she showed me this. I'm like, huh, I would have mistaken that for shrubbery. And she said, oh, yeah, it's a little hard to see now. Sorry. You just have to kind of squeeze yourself behind it and you can see it. It's back behind there. So if you go back here and put your back against this and then you squeeze along here, you look out and you can see the memorial. And sure enough, there it was. I mean, in the shrubbery, it's about 2 feet by 2 feet. List of names in the header, in memoriam, radiation effects study, 1960 to 72. It is facing the wall of the hospital. So I take these pictures to take and show to Martha Stevens, not knowing if she's visited it recently. And the woman with me says, well, would you like to see the Sanger lab? And I'm like, oh, like the Sanger lab, like Eugene Sanger? The villain, you know, the bad guy who designed these studies and killed all these people? I didn't say that. You know, I just said, yes, I would definitely like to see the Sanger lab. And so she took me up to see it. And there in the waiting area is this sort of little shrine to Eugene Sanger with his medals and pictures of him on the golf course and a bunch of old medical equipment. And, you know, I thought to myself, you know, what could be more emblematic of the way that these things work? You know, to the doctor behind the atrocities, a little mini shrine, and to the victims, a plaque hidden in the shrubbery. Well, turns out if you look at other studies, you will see something very similar, although no shrubbery. So, for example, look at John Cutler. Cutler was implicated in the Tuskegee syphilis study. Later, he was implicated in the Guatemala syphilis studies in the 1940s. This is the same man who, according to the Bioethics Commission set up by President Obama, dripped gonorrheal pus into the eyes of a dying woman in a mental institution to see if they would become infected before she died. They did. What happened to him? Well, he was a dean, of course, and then had a lectureship named after him at the University of Pittsburgh. This is Saul Krugman. He's the New York University pediatrician who gave hepatitis A and hepatitis B to institutionalize mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook School in Staten Island. What happened to him right after that was exposed? He was elected president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Albert Kligman. This is the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist who said famously that when he first went into Holmesburg Prison, what he saw was, quote, acres of skin, like a farmer gazing on a fertile field. Among his atrocities was in exchange for $10,000 from Dow Chemicals, he exposed prisoners there to the active ingredient in Agent Orange. What happened to him? Accolades, awards, at least 2 honorary degrees, and the presidency of his specialty organization. This is Chester Southam, who injected live cancer cells into elderly Jewish patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in the Bronx. What happened to him? His colleagues elected him president of the American Association for Cancer Research. Sanger himself, the man, the architect of the Cincinnati radiation studies, after he was exposed, his colleagues in radiology gave him their society's highest honor. Robert Heath, the psychiatrist at Tulane who worked with the CIA, accidentally killed 2 of his mentally ill subjects by giving them brain abscesses, and then infamously tried to use deep brain stimulation to turn a gay patient straight. What was his punishment? I think you're seeing the pattern here. Now, you might be thinking, well, look, those are all black and white pictures of white men from the distant past. Some of those honors are being reconsidered now, and it is true in the case of at least 2 of those, Cutler and Kligman. But you would be wrong to think this doesn't happen anymore. So during the 8 long years that the Dan Markington scandal was in the public eye here at the U, the chair of psychiatry, Chuck Schultz, just kept collecting honors and awards. And finally, if you're still hanging on to the hope that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, have a look at the bone marrow transplant scandal at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle. The whistleblower in that case, John Pasando, lost his job, never worked in cancer research again. He spent the rest of his life reviewing disability claims for the federal government. What about the co-investigator on that study, Don Thomas? In 1990, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So let me just finish by turning back to that question. Got to get Don off the screen there. Let me just finish by turning back to the question that I started with. What does this mean for whistleblowers? Because what I found is that every whistleblower needs some way of making sense of what happened to them. And very often they struggle to do this. But everybody's got to tell themselves a story. And when the story ends like this, with no justice at all, it's hard to come up with a whistleblower story that is not just terribly sad and demoralizing. It's a man in the hole story where the man never gets out of the hole. Because if you measure the value of your actions by what they achieved, in the story, you're going to tell yourself is that you were a chump, right? You were the dumb money at the table. Everybody else knew that the system was rigged. Everybody else knew that speaking out would do nothing. So they kept quiet. Only you were naive enough to throw away your career for nothing. And that's a very hard story to live with, right? Now, I do think that there are alternative stories that you can tell. I think, for example, it helps some people to tell themselves a story of honor, for example, because what honor requires is not that you succeed. What it requires is that you're able to respect yourself when it's over, right? For other people, I think it helps to think of their story as part of a bigger story, a larger struggle. So for civil rights, for example, a struggle in which the verdict is not going to be rendered by immediate success, but will be rendered by history. And maybe there are other stories to tell. And trying to think of more. Every person is different. Every situation is different. I would not want to suggest that these fit every whistleblower. But I think what whistleblowers do share is this kind of existential challenge that requires them to come up with some sort of story that they're able to live with, and maybe even get some out of the hole, although that may be too much to ask. All right, I'm done. I told you it was a demoralizing talk. I always feel awkward. It doesn't feel right to clap for this. It feels it feels right to, I don't know, for me. I don't know.
Do you really call them people on YouTube?
You know people's names more than I do, so.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's more or less super interesting. Talked a lot about the honor part of it. Could you talk a little bit more on the shame and origins of the shame and relationship to,
Well, that's sort of the flip side to honor. I mean, the feeling in the honor ethic when you do the right thing is pride. The feeling that when you do the wrong thing is shame. And usually anthropologists distinguish, shame and guilt. This distinguishing feature of shame is this imaginary audience for your actions, that you are imagining, the condemnation, or if you've done well, the pride, the praise that you would get from other people. And so, for those of us who, I'm from South Carolina, sort of the heart of the shame American culture. But if you talk to people really, where the honor ethic is really powerful, Japan, for example, there is where, the necessity of avoiding shame and finding some way to deal with your shame when you have failed can just be an extraordinarily powerful moral emotion. I mean, what I found was a lot of people, that was another thing that people resist. I just say, particularly here in Minnesota, I'll tell you, there's a guy, I'm trying to think, his name is Ryan Brown. I believe he's a political scientist. He may be an anthropologist, but he did a terrific book of empirical studies of honor. And one of the things that he did was look at, he developed a kind of measure of different parts of the United States where the honor ethic was strongest and weakest. And the places where it tends to be strongest in the United States are the places where you had Scots-Irish immigration in the 18th and 19th century, which turns out to be the South. Also the most violent part of the United States for related reasons. The South and the West. And so the place in the United States where he found that the honor ethic was strongest was South Carolina, which is where I grew up. And the place where it was weakest was South Dakota, and second weakest was Minnesota. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. I'd never thought about this before, so I learned a lot. I just have a question that it seems kind of like all of the whistleblowers were white men. There was maybe one woman and there were no Black folks that were whistleblowers. Do you think the honor code might mean something different depending on one's demographic position, as well as do you think there are different consequences based on one's race or gender in being whistleblowers, or is it just reflective of their positions in the organization?
My sense is it's probably more reflective of the positions, and it's an artifact of the period in which I was writing, and also the the specialties in which these things happened. So, for example, a lot of them happened in the 1970s and 80s. And for example, the unfortunate experiment in Auckland, New Zealand, all the victims were women, all the perpetrators were men. In fact, the entire staff in OBGYN, medical staff at National Women's was men. So there really was no opportunity for dissent there. What I will say is that, so Martha Stevens is the big outlier here. And, in my mind, an amazing human being, because look, not only was she a woman, she was an untenured English faculty member with nothing to gain and everything to lose. And I should also say that she's the only whistleblower in the story who did it twice. So she initially exposed them in the 1970s. And then when there was renewed attention in the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, where it turns out there was a whole, series of radiation experiments all over the United States, and there was more attention. She went back and did what she could to round up the victims and put them in touch with a lawyer so that they could sue her own institution. Now, one of the people that I did not write about in the book, partly because she's writing her own book, and partly because I might be too close of friends with her to write. I don't know. It felt as if her situation felt differently to me, but it's Nancy Oliveri in Canada, and her whistleblowing experience had to do with a drug company produced thalassemia drug that she felt was harming patients. And the drug company told her, she worked at the University of Toronto, that she couldn't tell the patients, and she did it anyway and got fired. Now, Nancy is as honor driven as anybody. I mean, she will just say, I'm Italian, right? So, never give up on a grudge, always strike back harder than they hit you, and very motivated by what I think people on the outside would see as vengeance, but what she sees as justice. And I would see that as justice as well. So I guess, I would say a lot of it is an artifact of the people that I talk to, and the medical specialties like cardiovascular surgery that tend to be male dominated. But there could be something else as well, because the honor ethic is very gendered, obviously.
Done.
Thanks. So this is, I really appreciate how much sociology is in here. My head's kind of spinning about which elements to bring in and kind of what's the right level of theoretical generalization, how much of this is about a particular institutional context like medicine. But the sociology study I kept thinking back to might not be appropriate, but I wanted to throw it, is Diane Vaughn's study, the Challenger disaster, which is marked by the absence of whistleblowers and a complete institutional failure. But her analysis, which ran counter to both the official U.S. investigations and all the other stuff, was that it wasn't banality. I mean, it wasn't evil. It was the banality of organizational culture, and just that everybody kind of went along with, for a magnitude of different reasons in incremental ways, a system that was inherently terrible, overly risky, and cost lots of lives. But she kind of rejects the notion of the morality and the evilness of it, which is interesting. I mean, in a certain sense, but especially in your context, because you're talking about how much the language of morality and moral and trust is what drives the whistleblowers. I'm sure you know that, study somewhat, but I'm kind of wondering, I guess, especially about the languages we use to kind of assign guilt and fault in organizational cultures. And then if there's something unique about the medical system or regime here relative to other institutional domains, or whether you really do think this is a general kind of issue and cause.
Yeah, I think all of the above. So there's a terrific book. I don't know if this is something that's read by Robert Jackal, called Moral Mazes, which is a kind of ethnographic study of middle managers. And one of the things that I remember that just really struck home for me is he talks about the way that bureaucracies, on the one hand, diffuse responsibility. There's something about working in a bureaucracy and answering to your specific role, and the sort of absence of knowledge of what's going on in the rest of the company, sometimes intentional. These are things that I don't want to know, that makes it feel as if you're sort of entering another world when you go to work for the company. he says, bureaucracies turn moral concerns into practical concerns. And so he has a few examples in the book, some of which are just mistakes, but others of which are also sort of corruption. And, the people who he, sort of the bystanders in the middle managers who said nothing, just kind of looked at the guy, the whistleblower, as, who does this moron thinks he is? Like, you don't do this. We all know that you're not supposed to do this. We don't want holier than thou evangelists in the company. Of course, he got fired. Everybody knew he was going to get fired. What a kind of dope. But they didn't talk about the morality of it at all. So, and the reason I mention that is there was one bystander that I talked to in the book, and he was very open with me. There was a study that I mentioned. It was a bone marrow transplant scandal at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle. This is John Pasando. This is the guy who won Don Thomas, who won the Nobel Prize. John found himself on an IRB in which the subjects in this study were just dying. Eventually everybody died, but these were very often subjects who would have had like a 60% chance of cure with standard treatment. They were just being funneled over 12 years in this study that everybody in the whole place knew was going to kill them. And John could not even get the IRB on side, right? Much less anybody else in the institution. But if you look back at the newspaper reports of the time and the court documents, because this did go to court and failed, as they usually do, there was another guy there named Reiner Storb who pushed back hard. This was the point of the study was to prevent graft versus host disease by tweaking the transplant, the T cells with monoclonal antibodies. And so that was his specialty. He had devised, a very good treatment for way of preventing graft versus host disease. And from the very beginning, he thought that this study that Pasando was protesting against was a disaster, and was open about it in court anyway. And so he's still alive. And so I thought maybe I should just try to talk to him. And when I did, he was very open, an incredibly nice guy, very open about his disappointment with Don Thomas for continuing to push this. Turned out he was also making millions from a biotech company, which is probably part of the reason why he kept going. He's like, I never would have done this study. They didn't do the animal work ahead of time. It was crappy science. I never take money from the biotech industry. It's just, or pharma. I don't do that. And I pushed back against it. I thought it was a bad study from the beginning. And he said, I can remember saying in meetings to Don Thomas, don't you think we've killed enough people at this point? And so I said, well, did it ever occur to you that you should go outside the institution? Like, go to the Office of Human Research Protection or the FDA or, somebody else. The people that John Pasando tried to contact for fear. And he said, oh, no, I could have never done that. And I said, why not? He said, well, it would have been impossible to continue working there. And these people I have to work with every day. If I'd ruined those relationships, it would have been over for my career. So I never did that. And I said, well, what do you think was different about John Pasando? And he said, oh, that guy, he's just strange. He was super weird. He was secretive. I think his career wasn't going well, so he tried to take it out on the Fred Hutch and, just vengeance. And I said, did it ever occur to you maybe that he, that he was acting out of conscientious reasons, that it was, ethics that motivated him? And he just paused as if this had never occurred to him, right? He just said, huh. Ethics, huh? You know, I guess it's possible. I don't think so. You know, no, I really doubt that. And, you know, that's what I think Jackal was talking about, you know, about how bureaucracies turn moral concerns into practical concerns. It was almost like, you know, the morality of blowing the whistle never even had entered his mind in all this time until I talked to him. He seemed to be genuinely stumped by the question.
I think we're gonna formally end, but if you have a few more minutes, I'll invite anyone who still has questions to come up and chat if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
But let's do another